Welcome back. Picture it. A February morning in 1880, the sky over the English countryside still charcoal gray, and somewhere inside a great stone manor house, a fire is already crackling in a grate that has not gone cold in 3 generations. A young housemaid, perhaps 16 years old, is on her knees on a marble floor at 4:30 in the morning, scrubbing at a stain no one upstairs will ever notice, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water. Upstairs, in rooms she will never be permitted to enter through the front door, a family sleeps beneath goose-down quilts, utterly unaware of the machinery of human labor keeping their world warm, fed, and beautiful. You are about to step inside that world. Using AI recreated imagery, architectural reconstructions, and paintings from the period itself, we are going to walk through this house together, floor by floor, from the coal cellar to the nursery, and by the end you will understand exactly why, for all its grandeur, almost none of us would have survived a single week living as most of its inhabitants did. And yes, before we finish, we will also see what became of houses like this one, and what you can still walk through today. To understand the manor at its height, you first have to understand what came before it. Most great Victorian estates were not built from nothing. They grew, often over centuries, from a Tudor farmhouse or a modest medieval hall, expanded generation after generation as money, then coal money, then railway money poured into English land. The families who first settled these estates in the 16th or 17th centuries had no grand design in mind. They wanted shelter, defensible walls, a well, and land that could be farmed or grazed. The geography mattered enormously. A manor needed a reliable water source, timber for building, and soil that could support both the estate and the tenant farms that would eventually fund it. Many of these early houses were modest, timber-framed structures with a handful of rooms, no separation between master and servant, and fires that smoked because there was no chimney at all, only a hole in the roof. The families living in these humble halls in, say, 1650, could not have imagined that within 2 centuries their descendants would preside over 60-room mansions with imported marble and their own private railway sidings. They were simply trying to get through a hard winter. By 1880, the transformation was complete, and the results were staggering. A great manor of this era might contain anywhere from 40 to over 100 rooms, built from dressed limestone or red brick, often faced with a fashionable veneer of Gothic revival towers or a restrained neoclassical portico, depending on when the last major renovation had occurred. The entrance hall alone could rise 2 full stories, lit by a glass cupola and warmed, in theory, by a fireplace large enough to stand inside. Floors were laid in patterned marble or polished oak parquet. Walls were hung with silk damask that cost more per yard than a servant earned in a month. And yet, for all this polish, the house was never finished. Plumbing was being retrofitted awkwardly into wings never designed for it, water closets installed in former dressing rooms, gas lines run through walls built for candlelight, and somewhere there was almost always scaffolding, a leaking roof valley, or a wing closed off for repair. These houses were living organisms, constantly being patched, updated, and argued over by architects and impatient owners, right up until the day they were sold, requisitioned, or simply allowed to crumble in the 20th century. At the heart of the house's moral and social order sat the chapel, or, in Anglican estates, the family pew reserved at the parish church, along with the estate office, where the land agent conducted the real business of power. Religion in 1880 was not private. It was structural. Morning prayers might be read aloud by the master of the house to the assembled staff before breakfast, a ritual that reinforced hierarchy as much as faith. The estate office functioned almost like a small court, where tenant disputes were settled, rents collected, and punishments for poaching or debt decided, often by the same family that had held that authority for 200 years. Servants' behavior was governed by an unwritten but rigid code enforced by the housekeeper and butler, who held disciplinary authority nearly equal to the family itself. Different eras of the house's life were visible everywhere you looked. A medieval undercroft beneath a Georgian dining room, a Victorian conservatory bolted onto a Tudor wing, each layer a physical record of the family's rising fortunes. Now walk with us below stairs, into the world that actually kept the manor running. In a house of this size, you might find 20 to 40 servants, a number that could rival a small village. The kitchen alone might employ a cook, 2 or 3 kitchen maids, and a scullery maid whose entire existence revolved around washing pots in water that was rarely more than lukewarm. The day began before dawn and rarely ended before 11 at night. Housemaids like the girl we met at the start earned perhaps 12 to 18 pounds a year, roughly what a skilled tradesman might earn in 2 months, and they worked nearly 90 hours a week for it. Meals below stairs were monotonous: bread, cheese, weak tea, and meat only a few times weekly, while upstairs a formal dinner might run to 10 courses. The social gulf inside a single building was staggering. Servants were expected to press themselves against walls and avert their eyes if a family member passed in a corridor, effectively required to become invisible in their own workplace. And yet servants left their mark too. Initials scratched into attic beams, a name carved discreetly into a windowsill, small human proof that they had been there, even if history rarely recorded them by name. If you wanted spectacle in 1880, you did not need to leave the estate. The great hall or ballroom was where the family's social standing was performed most visibly, a space that could hold 200 or 300 guests for a hunt ball, lit by hundreds of candles or, in the most modern houses, the still novel marvel of electric light. These events were logistical operations on the scale of a small military campaign, involving weeks of preparation, imported delicacies, and orchestras brought from London. One particularly famous ball at a Yorkshire estate in this era was remembered locally for decades after a chandelier crashed into the dance floor moments after the last guests had cleared it, a near disaster that became a beloved piece of family lore. These evenings mattered enormously to community identity. They were where marriages were arranged, alliances confirmed, and a family's continued relevance to the county was proven or quietly called into question. For a glimpse of true privilege, step into the private library and adjoining picture gallery, a space few outside the family and their closest friends ever entered. Here you would find leather-bound first editions, portraits by fashionable society painters, and furniture upholstered in silks brought from India and China at extraordinary cost. The master of the house might spend an entire morning here simply reading, while 3 floors below a scullery maid's hands cracked open from cold water. It is worth remembering, standing in this beautiful, quiet room, that whatever storm was coming for the manor, whether financial ruin, agricultural depression, war, or simple changing taste, it would not spare the family in the library any more than it spared the girl on her knees in the kitchen passage. And a storm was coming. Beginning in the mid-1870s and accelerating through the 1880s, a prolonged agricultural depression swept across rural England, driven by cheap imported grain arriving from the American Midwest by steamship and rail at prices English farmers simply could not match. Rents, the lifeblood of estates like this one, began falling, in some counties by as much as 25 to 30% over the following 2 decades. In the moment, many landowning families believed this was a temporary dip, the kind of bad harvest cycle their grandfathers had weathered before. What was actually happening was structural and permanent, a fundamental rewiring of the global economy that no single bad season could explain and no traditional remedy could fix. Families raised on the certainty of land as eternal wealth increasingly found sons packed off to seek fortune in the professions or the colonies. Staff quietly let go a few at a time so as not to alarm the neighbors. Wings of the house closed and dust sheeted room by room. It was not a single dramatic collapse but a slow, grinding erosion, a candle burning down rather than being blown out. And by the time many families understood the full scale of what was happening, the damage was largely irreversible. In the decades that followed, many of these estates limped on through the Edwardian years, only to be hit by a second, harder blow, the First World War, which drained a generation of heirs and drove death duties to punishing new heights. Houses that had stood for centuries were abandoned in stages, closed room by room, then wing by wing, their contents sold at auction, their gardens reclaimed by bramble. Some were requisitioned by the military in 2 world wars and returned damaged or simply worn beyond repair. Roofs were removed by desperate owners seeking to avoid property taxes on an occupied structure, a practice so common in the mid-20th century that it became known grimly as roof tax demolition. Local memory of who had lived and worked in these houses faded quickly once the last family member left and the last elderly former servant passed away. It was not until the mid-20th century, and accelerating through the 1970s and beyond, that serious effort went into rescuing and studying what remained. Preservation trusts began acquiring crumbling estates, and social historians turned their attention, for the first time in a systematic way, not just to the families who had owned these houses but to the servants who had run them. What they found was extraordinary. Still legible below stairs account books recording servants' wages down to the shilling, uniforms preserved in attic trunks, and in several houses, servant call bell systems still wired into the walls, a physical map of exactly which rooms had summoned help and how often. These small, ordinary objects told a far richer story than the grand portraits ever could, revealing the sheer scale of human effort required to sustain a single day of aristocratic comfort. It is worth pausing here briefly to remember that these were not museum pieces when they were built. They were homes, full of arguments over breakfast, children learning to walk on cold stone floors, servants nursing sore feet by a dying kitchen fire at midnight. Every room we have walked through today once held someone's entire working life, or someone's entire childhood. The house outlived almost all of them, and that quiet fact is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. So what remains today? The Great Hall in many surviving manors is now the first stop on a public tour. Its chandelier rehung and its floor roped off to protect the same parquet that servants once polished on their knees before dawn. The below-stairs kitchen, once the domain of dozens of overworked staff, is frequently the most popular exhibit in the entire house, restored with its copper pans and servant call board intact, precisely because visitors find it more relatable than the gilded rooms above. The private library and picture gallery, once accessible only to family and honored guests, is now open to anyone holding a ticket, its silk-lined walls carefully conserved under museum lighting. Many family portraits remain in situ, while others were sold decades ago and now hang in national galleries, reunited with their original settings only through photographs and careful research. The servants' attic bedrooms, tiny, sloped ceiling rooms that once housed 2 or 3 maids apiece, are in the best preserved houses left almost untouched, allowing visitors to stand in a space barely large enough for a bed and a washstand and feel, for just a moment, the physical reality of that 16-year-old housemaid's entire private world. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and stepping through these walls together. If there is a place, a vanished world, or a single dramatic turning point in history you would love to see brought back to life next, drop it in the comments below. We genuinely read every suggestion, and many of our best episodes have started exactly that way. If you enjoyed this walk through 1880, consider subscribing so you don't miss where we go next, and we will see you at the next doorway into the past.